Arthur smiled at Julian, raising his champagne flute. Congratulations on the new coastal deed, Julian. Signing Clara's estate to you is one hell of a gift. Aunt Brenda froze. Evelyn and Arthur exchanged panicked glances. I calmly sipped my Chardonnay. I had learned to stomach dry wine at high society functions. It made the performances tolerable. I set the glass down and smiled smoothly. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is right now. I would love to know who is in our community. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 15 years. While Julian was elevated as the golden heir, the undisputed primary asset on our family balance sheet, I was categorized as a permanent liability. It was a calculated position they forced me into. Arthur attempted to clear his throat and wave a dismissive hand, trying to kill the conversation right there on the VIP terrace. He wanted to close the ledger before anyone could audit the entries. But Aunt Brenda was not an employee he could terminate. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she insisted on the specific details of this sudden coastal deed transfer. I watched Arthur sweat. He did not want her dragging out the $450,000 corporate trust fund transfer that he had secretly executed. He had thought that transaction was buried deep in the archives. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For over a decade, I had endured their psychological framing. They had built an intricate architecture of controlled gaslighting, a specific psychological trap designed for prolonged familial compliance. They groomed me to believe that my mere existence was a debt I owed them. Every request for support was met with a reminder of the roof over my head. My signature became their revolving line of credit. They convinced me that signing away my rights was simply my mandatory subscription fee for being part of the family. The gaslighting was so methodical, so expertly managed, that I never questioned why I was footing the bill for a lifestyle I was never allowed to enjoy. They forced me to pay my own way through community college, repeatedly denying me any career seed capital, while Julian received unlimited funding for every failed venture he dreamed up. I was conditioned to accept the role of the perpetual debtor. They leveraged my compliance, turning family affection into a strictly business transaction, where I provided the capital and they provided the criticism. But tonight, they were not shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. Arthur tried to laugh off Aunt Brenda's questions, calling it a simple restructuring of family assets. He looked at me, expecting me to nod and validate his lie, just as I had been trained to do. He expected the silent partner to remain silent, but my emotional bankruptcy was over. I had audited my own life, and the discrepancies were glaring. The $450,000 was just the principal. The interest they owed me was 15 years of stolen agency. I looked at Arthur, watching the desperate panic behind his strained smile. I did not feel betrayed. I just felt ready to liquidate the partnership. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted forensic tablet. The time for emotional endurance had expired. It was time for clinical execution. I tapped in my passcode, the screen illuminating my face with a cold blue light. I did not hesitate. I opened the master file I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Arthur's smile finally cracked, shattering into a mask of pure dread. I pulled up 15 years of audited bank transcripts, shell company wire transfers, and high-resolution notarized PDFs. The data was impeccable. I turned the tablet so Aunt Brenda could see the glowing charts and highlighted transactions. I calmly detailed how Arthur and Evelyn did not merely mismanage family funds. That would imply incompetence. This was systematic, intentional embezzlement. I showed them the specific routing numbers where $450,000 had been drained from my personal trust account. The funds had not evaporated into poor investments. They had been deliberately funneled into a customized lifestyle. I tapped the screen, pulling up the purchase agreement for a 60-foot yacht moored in Carmel. Next, I displayed the receipts for premium-tier country club memberships. Finally, I opened the banking record showing massive, repeated withdrawals at high-stakes casino tables in Reno. The accounting was undeniable. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sensing the shift in power, he instinctively defaulted to his oldest strategy. He rubbed his knee, attempting to flash his old college athletic injuries, his face contorting into a mask of practiced suffering. He whined that the money had been necessary to cover his extensive physical therapy and rehabilitation costs, playing the victim with the ease of a lifelong fraud. But his narrative was no longer sustainable. I systematically dismantled his lies with time-stamped digital audits. I pulled up the medical insurance records, proving his physical therapy had been fully covered by Evelyn's premium corporate policy. There were 0 out-of-pocket expenses. I then displayed the geolocation data tied to his credit card transactions on the exact dates he claimed to be in rehabilitation clinics. The data proved he was actually charging VIP bottle service at nightclubs in Las Vegas. He was not a victim recovering from a tragic sports injury. He was a co-conspirator, enjoying the dividends of my stolen trust. Julian's face flushed a deep mottled red. He opened his mouth to argue, but the time-stamped evidence was an impenetrable wall. They had treated my life like a slush fund, assuming the quiet, compliant daughter would never possess the technical skills to trace the missing capital. They were wrong. I had scrutinized every routing number, every forged authorization, every hidden offshore account. The anger I felt was not loud. It was a precise, focused beam of light cutting through decades of shadows. I swiped to the next page of the file, laying bare the exact dates Arthur had authorized the Reno withdrawals. The evidence was absolute, categorized, and chronologically ordered. There was no room for debate. This was not a family dispute over misunderstood intentions. This was a forensic dissection of a 15-year financial crime, and I was the lead investigator delivering the final report. Evelyn let out a breathy, nervous laugh, attempting to reframe the devastating data glowing on the tablet. She waved her hand dismissively, telling Aunt Brenda that this was all just a misunderstanding over a simple family loan. She tried to insist that families borrow from each other all the time, and that I was simply being overly analytical. But I was not an emotional daughter seeking an apology. I was a forensic auditor closing a major case. I tapped the screen again, loading the next directory. It was time for the kill shot twist. I looked directly at Arthur and delivered the revelation with absolute freezing calm. The charity foundation they had established a decade ago was not a philanthropic endeavor. I pulled up the tax filings, the hidden corporate structures, and the routing logs. It was an illicit Ponzi front. It was a sophisticated vehicle specifically designed to hide millions of dollars in diverted corporate assets and to generate illegal tax write-offs. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. I did not stop. I displayed the incorporation documents for the foundation, highlighting the executive board members. The paperwork directly implicated Julian as a primary co-conspirator. He was listed as the chief operations officer, actively signing off on the fraudulent transfers. His name was on every illegal tax filing. Julian stared at the screen, all the color draining from his face as he realized the magnitude of his exposure. But the corporate fraud was only the preliminary charge. I opened a high-resolution scan of the recent quitclaim deed, the one Arthur had toasted to just minutes ago. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the page. Then, I pulled up a side-by-side comparison of my actual notarized signature. I ran a high-resolution digital spectroscopic scan through my mobile forensics app, instantly verifying the ink composition against my registered archives. I explained the forensic proof with clinical detachment. Arthur had forged my signature on the quitclaim deed. The digital magnification clearly showed the signature had been executed using a distinct 0.7 millimeter blue ink pen. The stroke pressure and ink pooling were entirely inconsistent with my writing. Furthermore, I legally register all of my professional and personal documents exclusively in black archival ink. I have maintained this strict personal protocol for 7 years, specifically for security purposes. The blue ink was an amateur oversight, a sloppy error made by a man who believed his authority was absolute. The atmosphere on the terrace shifted instantly. The air grew thin and cold. This was no longer a civil family dispute over a mismanaged trust fund or questionable loan. I had just presented irrefutable, documented proof of massive corporate embezzlement, tax evasion, and document forgery. The stakes had transformed in the blink of an eye. They were no longer looking at awkward family tension. They were looking at indictable federal felonies. The silence that fell over our table was heavy and absolute. They were not staring at a daughter they had wronged. They were staring at the architect of their impending incarceration. The business transaction of our family was officially terminated, and the federal authorities would be the next to review the ledger. Evelyn's composure finally shattered. She broke down, launching into her classic tearful performance, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. It was a calculated display of manufactured grief designed to elicit sympathy. But her performance failed instantly. The high society gala crowd around us had gone completely silent, their attention locked onto our table. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only cold, fascinated judgment. Evelyn's tears could not wash away the forensic evidence glowing brightly on the table. Sensing his wife's failure, Arthur resorted to intimidation. He stood up, knocking his chair backward, and aggressively threatened me with immediate legal retaliation. He hissed that his lawyers would destroy me for defamation. But Aunt Brenda did not flinch. She reached into the heavy leather portfolio binder I had placed beside my seat, pulled out the certified physical copy of the forged quitclaim deed, and held it up to the light. She looked at the blue ink, then looked Arthur dead in the eye, effectively blocking his aggressive posturing. Her silent validation of the forgery stripped him of his remaining authority. I stood up and slowly walked the perimeter of the terrace, putting physical distance between myself and their collapsing empire. I announced to my parents, my brother, and the listening crowd that the U.S. Attorney's Office and Federal White-Collar Crimes Division had already accepted the complete digital evidence packet. The submission was logged and confirmed at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. There would be no secret family negotiations. There would be no quiet settlement. The federal machinery was already in motion. Julian lost whatever remained of his fragile self-control. In a blind, panicked rage, he lunged forward, his face twisted in unhinged fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming at the top of his lungs that I was a vindictive fraud. He yelled that I was a jealous liar, trying to ruin his life out of pure spite. But his explosive tantrum was the final nail in his own coffin. Dozens of guests had already pulled out their phones. Julian was completely destroying his public reputation on a multitude of live recording devices. The high society crowd captured every second of his unhinged, screaming meltdown. He was publicly verifying his instability and desperation for the entire financial community to witness. I watched him scream, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. His tantrum guaranteed that no corporate board, no investment bank, and no reputable financial institution would ever touch him again. His career was liquidated in a matter of seconds. Broadcast in high definition, Arthur grabbed Julian by the arm, trying to drag him back, but the damage was irreversible. The gala attendees whispered and pointed, their phones continuously recording the spectacular implosion of a once respected family. I did not stay to watch them try to gather the shattered pieces of their dignity. I simply picked up my encrypted tablet, turned my back on the chaos, and walked toward the exit. The balance sheet was finally settled. The liabilities had been completely removed from my life, and the transaction was flawlessly executed. Over a year of relentless federal investigation, grand jury indictments, and intense legal maneuvering later, faced with the mountain of forensic data I had provided, Arthur's high-priced legal team advised him to surrender. He accepted a plea deal consisting of an 18-month federal prison sentence for corporate fraud and document forgery. Evelyn received 5 years of strict probation and a mandate for heavy financial restitution. Julian, stripped of his corporate titles and blacklisted from the financial sector, was saddled with court-ordered monthly payments to repay the stolen trust funds, living under the constant threat of immediate imprisonment if he ever defaulted on a single installment. I stood on the cliffside balcony of my Carmel estate, listening to the crash of the Pacific Ocean below. The property was wholly owned, legally secure, and registered entirely in my name. I held a glass of exceptional, full-bodied red wine, savoring the complex notes as the evening sun painted the horizon in shades of copper and gold. My phone vibrated on the glass table beside me, the screen lighting up with a final series of desperate text messages from Evelyn and Julian. They were pleading for leniency, begging for financial assistance, asking me to remember that we were family. I looked at the notifications with total analytical detachment. I did not respond. I simply swiped the screen, blocking their numbers and closing the chapter permanently. Standing there in the quiet breeze, I reflected on the catastrophic speed of their downfall. It perfectly illustrated the fragility of rented status. Status-obsessed narcissists construct their entire identities around the perception of wealth and influence. They do not build genuine respect. They lease it using capital. Their power is entirely dependent on the illusion of financial liquidity. When you strip away that liquidity, you do not just take their money, you demolish their structural integrity. They collapse so completely because there is no foundational character beneath the expensive suits and country club memberships. Once the capital evaporated, Arthur, Evelyn, and Julian were revealed to be empty shells, incapable of surviving without the fraudulent wealth that had propped them up. They had treated love and loyalty as exploitable assets, failing to realize that true security cannot be forged or embezzled. I took another sip of wine, feeling the cool ocean air against my face. The balance was restored. The audit was successfully closed. I had severed the toxic supply chain that had drained my resources for 15 years. I had not sought revenge out of malice. I had merely balanced the ledger and allowed the mathematics of justice to execute the final calculations. Looking out over the vast, clean horizon, I felt an absolute, unshakable sovereignty. I was no longer a liability on someone else's balance sheet. I was the sole proprietor of my own life, and the future was entirely mine to underwrite. The silence of the tides below was the only sound I needed. The noise of their desperation had been silenced by the indisputable truth of the numbers. I breathed in the salt air, knowing that my emotional bankruptcy was a thing of the past. The accounts were settled, the debts were paid, and my independence was permanently secured. I have spent a lot of time analyzing the mechanics of true sovereignty since the gavel fell. It is easy to look at the legal victories, the reclaimed trust funds, and the coastal property, and assume that financial independence is the ultimate goal. But I've come to realize that true independence is not merely about the wealth you accumulate. It is profoundly about the vast, quiet, mental space you reclaim after cutting off the toxic anchors that kept you submerged. For 15 years, my mind was occupied by their relentless demands, their endless criticisms, and their fraudulent emotional ledgers. Erasing them from my life did not just return my stolen capital, it returned my absolute clarity. When you stop funding the illusion of a relationship, you suddenly have the internal resources to invest entirely in yourself. I am speaking directly to you now, because I know some of you are looking at your own emotional balance sheets and feeling the weight of the deficit. You are pouring your energy, your love, and your resources into people who view you only as an endless line of credit. You are desperately trying to maintain emotional boundaries that are constantly being breached by those who claim that blood entitles them to your infinite sacrifice. It does not. You have the absolute right to audit your relationships. You have the right to demand a return on your emotional investments, and you possess the unquestionable authority to liquidate any family partnership that leaves you spiritually or financially bankrupt. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free, but forgiveness does not require continued association. You can forgive the debt in your heart while still permanently closing the account. It is perfectly okay to walk away from a table where genuine respect is no longer being served. Your peace of mind is your most valuable asset, and it is entirely yours to protect. Do not let anyone convince you that protecting your peace is an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. If this story resonated with your own journey of breaking free from toxic obligations, hit subscribe, drop your thoughts in the comments below, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that blood does not require your bondage. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and delivered right on time. See you in the next story.